Thanks for joining me. Let's consider the Syrian situation, shall we? Why did Syrian President Bashar al-Assad meet with Russia's President Vladimir Putin in Sochi on May the 17th, 2018? The explanation offered by Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov was, quote, quite comprehensive negotiations took place, unquote. With his tongue in his cheek, no doubt, and perfectly aware of where the credit really lay, Putin congratulated Assad on the success of the Syrian government forces in the fight against terrorist groups. He then moved on to the consequences of that success. Putin has said more than once that as the military phase of the Syrian conflict reached its end, the time for constitutional reform and the resumption of a fully fledged political process could follow. This, moreover, would allow him to withdraw the bulk of Russian armed support, another objective he stated on more than one occasion. Whether or not any pressure was applied to Assad, he enthusiastically endorsed Putin's position. In a statement following the talks, he said, quote, "Today I confirmed to President Putin that Syria will send a list of its delegates to the UN Constitutional Committee to discuss amendments to the current constitution. This will be done as soon as possible," unquote. But there was something odd about the whole proceeding, because everything agreed between Putin and Assad on May the 17th had already been signed and sealed back in January at the Congress held in Sochi, to which the UN Special Envoy to Syria, Staffan de Mistura, had been invited. De Mistura had appreciated the significance of his invitation. In a message to media representatives, he noted that in its final declaration, the Congress had agreed that a constitutional committee should be formed, tasked to draft a constitutional reform, and that it should include the Syrian government delegation, Syrian experts, independents, tribal leaders, women, and representatives of Syria's ethnical and religious leaders. Also to be included was a widely representative opposition grouping. Syrian government representatives had so far consistently refused to sit down with the main opposition group, which wants Assad to have no part in Syria's future. De Mistura was pleased that the task of establishing the Constitutional Committee had been remitted to him as the UN Special Envoy, and that final agreement was to be reached within the UN-led Geneva process. He'd decide the criteria for committee members and select about 50 people. Since agreement had already been reached, why did Putin summon Assad back to Sochi for a further head-to-head? Perhaps to emphasize that this time the Syrian government delegation simply must sit at the table and negotiate. Perhaps to guarantee that whatever the outcome of the constitutional process, Assad would not be unceremoniously booted from office. Perhaps to make a generous offer, if such an eventuality becomes necessary, of a dignified retirement and a luxurious haven in Russia for Assad and his family. Whatever else Putin's purposes may have been, there was certainly a need to stiffen Assad's resolve to proceed with the Constitutional Committee, for Assad's team seemed obstructive. Ahmad al-Kuzbari, a Syrian parliamentary and a participant in the Sochi conference, had pronounced that any constitutional amendments or additions proposed by the new UN Constitutional Committee would have to be subject to a referendum in Syria. Quote, "Nothing will happen," said al-Kuzbari, "except under the provisions of the current constitution, which the people voted on in 2012, unquote. He seemed to envisage the UN Constitutional Committee validating the Syrian constitution, which had been hastily introduced by Assad back in 2012 in an attempt to stave off the rapidly growing civil rebellion. The new constitution, which established a form of democracy and presidential elections, abolished the one-party state, and limited the term of office for the president to 7 years with a maximum of 1 re-election. That was adopted on the 27th of February 2012, following a referendum. Now, with what authority did al-Kuzbari speak? Well, a careful comparison of Assad's compliant words to Putin with what de Mistura has said reveals the basis of al-Kuzbari's assertion. This is what Assad said, quote, "Today I confirmed to President Putin that Syria will send a list of its delegates to the UN Constitutional Committee to discuss amendments to the current constitution," unquote. What did de Mistura say? Quote, "A constitutional committee is to be formed comprising the delegation of the Syrian Arab Republic government along with a widely represented opposition delegation for drafting a constitutional reform," unquote. So Assad envisages discussing amendments to the current constitution, and de Mistura believes his committee will be drafting constitutional reform. Now, if hardliners believe they can stave off the introduction of a newly conceived constitution by insisting that the 2012 one remains valid and could be used to veto it, they may be greatly mistaken. It's more than likely that the committee will recommend starting with a completely clean slate. Well, thank you for listening, and do please join me again next time. Goodbye.